For 25 years, David Porter has lived as the son of a ghost story, the young couple who stepped onto the Starlight Express in 1986 and never stepped off. The official report called it a tragic, inexplicable disappearance, leaving a cloud of mystery that has shadowed David's entire life. But when a group of urban explorers posts a photo online of a rusty piece of metal found in an abandoned Chicago rail yard, a cabin locking pin from a decommissioned train, David feels a jolt of recognition that pulls him from his quiet grief and into the heart of the mystery that stole his parents. Before we uncover what really happened on that train, I'm curious to know what you think. If you found a clue to a long-lost family mystery, would you pursue it, no matter where it led? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The hum of the computer was the only sound in David's quiet apartment. At 30 years old, he had built a life of careful order as an architectural draftsman. His world was one of precise lines and calculated angles, a stark contrast to the vast, undefined emptiness left by his parents, Robert and Mary Porter. He was only 5 when they vanished, leaving him to be raised by a grandmother who spoke of them in hushed, sorrowful tones. All he had left of them were a few faded photographs and the official story. They boarded a sleeper car on the Starlight Express, bound for San Francisco, and were never seen again. The train arrived at its destination, but their cabin was empty, their luggage still neatly stowed on the overhead rack. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, nothing. They had simply ceased to exist somewhere between Chicago and the West Coast. On this particular Tuesday night, David was scrolling aimlessly through a local history forum, a habit he'd developed to feel some connection to the city his parents had left behind. A new post caught his eye: relics from the South Chicago Railyard. It was a gallery of photos taken by a group of young people who explored abandoned places. He clicked through images of graffiti-covered train cars and rusted tracks overgrown with weeds. Then he saw it. The 10th photo was a close-up of a corroded piece of metal lying on a bed of gravel. The caption read, "Found this old locking pin near a sleeper car. Looks ancient." David's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any pin. It was a heavy, T-shaped piece of steel with a distinct, circular head, a design he knew intimately from the one photograph he cherished most: his parents, smiling and waving from the window of their train cabin just before it departed. In the corner of that photo, clear as day, was the exterior lock of their cabin, and sticking out of it was the exact same type of pin. A cold certainty washed over him. He wasn't just looking at a random piece of scrap metal. He was looking at a piece of his own history. The ghost story that had defined his life suddenly had a tangible object attached to it, a rusty anchor in a sea of questions. He saved the image, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in 25 years, he felt a flicker not of grief, but of purpose. He had to find that train car. The next morning, David called in sick to work. His first stop was the National Railway Archives, a place he hadn't even known existed until a frantic search online the night before. The building was quiet and smelled of old paper. He explained his situation to a clerk, who looked at him with a mixture of pity and disinterest before directing him to a retired archivist who volunteered on Wednesdays, a man named Thomas Schmidt. Thomas was an elderly man with kind eyes and hands stained with ink. Unlike the clerk, his face lit up with interest as David told his story and showed him the printed-out photo of the pin. "Starlight Express, 1986, Thomas murmured, adjusting his glasses. "I remember when that happened. It was a real head-scratcher. The police talked to everyone, but it was like they vanished into thin air." He led David to a back room filled with towering shelves of ledgers and boxes. "Let's see what we can find. We need the date they left and the car number." David provided the date, July 12th, 1986. For the next 2 hours, they pored over dusty manifests and maintenance logs. Finally, Thomas grunted in triumph. "Here we are. Porter, Robert, and Mary. Sleeper car 7, cabin B." He ran his finger down the page. "Car 7. That's interesting." "What is it?" David asked, leaning closer. "According to this, car 7 was flagged for a faulty axle coupling the very next day," Thomas explained. "It was uncoupled from the main train at a siding in rural Illinois for emergency repair. The rest of the train continued on. The log says the car was supposed to be towed back to the main yard later that week." He flipped through a few more pages, his brow furrowed, but there's no record of it ever being picked up. The paperwork just stops. The car was eventually listed as decommissioned and sent to the South Chicago yard to be scrapped. The same yard from the photos. David's heart hammered in his chest. So my parents were in a car that got disconnected from the train? It seems that way, but the crew would have checked the car before uncoupling it. It's standard procedure. They would have found them, Thomas said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He scribbled something on a notepad and handed it to David. This is the serial number for sleeper car 7. It's probably still sitting in that yard if it wasn't scrapped. And this is the crew manifest for that run. David thanked Thomas, his mind reeling. He drove straight to the South Chicago Railyard. It was even more desolate in person, a sprawling graveyard of iron giants. He showed the serial number to a gruff security guard who, for a $20 bill, pointed him toward a forgotten corner of the lot. And there it was. Sleeper car 7. It was rusted through in places, its windows cloudy with grime, but the number was still faintly visible. David felt a profound, chilling connection to the decaying metal box. This was the last place his parents had been. The cabin door was sealed shut with rust and time. He walked its length, running his hand along the cold steel. Near the door for cabin B, he saw a small gaping hole where the locking pin should have been. He spent the rest of the afternoon back in his apartment, staring at the crew manifest. He looked up each name online. The engineer had passed away in the 90s. The porters were untraceable. But one name stood out: James Collier, the conductor. An old news article mentioned his retirement in 1990. A subsequent search brought up a property record in a small town in southern Illinois called Terminus. The name seemed almost too perfect. David looked at the photos of his parents on his mantelpiece. He had a destination. He had a name. The hunt had begun. The drive to Terminus took 3 hours, taking him from the concrete sprawl of Chicago to the flat, open farmlands of rural Illinois. The town itself was little more than a main street, with a few dozen houses branching off it. It felt quiet and isolated, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. As he pulled up to the only diner in town to ask for directions, he noticed something odd. The sign above the diner had a small, stylized train engine on it. So did the sign for the local hardware store. The town, he realized, was steeped in railway culture. He asked the woman behind the counter if she knew where he could find James Collier. Her friendly expression immediately tightened. "Who's asking?" she said, her voice turning cautious. "My name is David Porter. I'm trying to find some information about an old train route he used to work on," David said, trying to sound casual. The woman's eyes narrowed. "A lot of folks in this town used to work for the railroad. We like to keep to ourselves. Mr. Collier especially." She gave him a vague gesture down a side street. "His house is the last one on the left, at the end of Oak Street. But he doesn't much like visitors." The encounter set the tone for the rest of his search. The whole town felt like a closed circle, protective of its own. When he finally found the house at the end of Oak Street, it was small and in need of a coat of paint. A weathered-looking man in his late 70s was sitting on the porch, staring out at the fields. He had a stern, deeply lined face and the hard, unforgiving eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime looking down long stretches of track. "James Collier?" David asked from the bottom of the porch steps. The old man didn't move. "I am, and unless you're here to read the meter, you can turn around and leave." David took a deep breath and held up the photo of the rusty pin. "I think you know why I'm here. I want to talk about the Starlight Express, July 12th, 1986. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed the old conductor's face. Not surprise, but a deep, weary recognition, as if he'd been expecting this visit for a very long time. He slowly pushed himself out of his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. "You should have left it alone, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Some things are better left buried." David stood his ground, his heart pounding. "My parents are buried somewhere because of what happened on your train. I'm not leaving until you tell me why." The old man, James, stared at David for a long moment, his gaze seeming to peel back the years, seeing not the 30-year-old man before him, but the 5-year-old boy who was left behind. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he finally gestured toward the other rocking chair on his porch. "Sit down," he said, his voice cracking. "It's a long story." David sat, his muscles tense. James lowered himself back into his own chair, which creaked in protest. He didn't speak right away, just stared out at the horizon as the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Your father," James began, his voice raspy with disuse, "was an arrogant man. At least, he was that night." He recounted the beginning of the journey out of Chicago. Robert Porter had apparently been upset about a small stain on his cabin's sheets and had spoken to James with a dismissive, condescending tone. treating him not as the conductor of the train, but as a lowly servant. He waved his hand at me like I was nothing, James said, bitterness lacing his words. Told me to just take care of it. People like that, they never see the men who keep the world moving for them. They just expect it to move. The slight, however minor it seemed, had festered in James's mind for hours. As the train sped through the night, he decided on a small, petty act of revenge. He waited until he was sure the porters were asleep. Using a conductor's master key, he went to the outside of their cabin and jammed the locking pin, locking them inside. It was a stupid, childish thing to do, he admitted, not looking at David. I was just going to let them stew in there for an hour or two. Let them feel what it was like to be helpless. I planned to unlock it before my shift ended, have a little laugh to myself, and that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. A little after 2 a.m., a call came crackling over the radio. A freight train derailment up ahead had damaged the main line. All westbound traffic was being rerouted. In the ensuing chaos, a message came down from dispatch. A mechanical report had flagged their last car, Sleeper Car 7, for a potential axle issue that needed immediate inspection. To avoid delaying the entire train, the order was given to uncouple Car 7 at the next maintenance siding. It was a madhouse, James recalled. We were behind schedule, rerouting. Everything was happening at once. My only thought was to get that car disconnected so we could get moving again. The protocol is to do a walkthrough of any car being left behind. I know that. But in the rush, I just didn't. He finally turned to look at David, his eyes filled with a hollow, ancient guilt. I told the crew it was empty. It was my job to check, and I told them it was empty. I completely forgot about the pin. I just wanted to be rid of the car and the problem. The rest of the Starlight Express continued its journey west, leaving Sleeper Car 7 sitting alone on a forgotten track in the middle of the Illinois prairie. The paperwork for the disconnected car was supposed to be filed at the next major stop, but in the confusion of the rerouting, it was misplaced. James, nursing his grudge, and now terrified of the consequences of his actions, said nothing. He convinced himself the car would be picked up in the morning, that the couple would be found, angry and inconvenienced, but alive. But no one came. The misplaced work order meant that, on paper, Sleeper Car 7 didn't officially exist on that siding. It was a ghost car. Days later, a towing crew, working off an old decommission list, finally came for it. Assuming it was empty, as per its status, they hauled it not to a maintenance depot, but directly to the South Chicago Railyard. The graveyard. And there it sat, sealed and silent, for 25 years. A heavy silence settled over the porch as James finished his story. The crickets in the nearby field began their evening chorus, indifferent to the confession that had just shattered David's world. The truth was somehow both more senseless and more tragic than anything he could have imagined. His parents hadn't been the victims of some grand, violent crime. They had been the victims of a moment of petty anger and a series of bureaucratic errors. They had died alone, trapped in a steel box, all because of a stained sheet. David felt a wave of nausea. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden porch. "You just left them," he said, his voice barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and a rising tide of rage. James nodded slowly, his face crumpling. "I was a coward," he choked out, tears finally welling in his eyes. "I was afraid of losing my job, my pension, so I stayed quiet. Every day for 25 years, I've woken up knowing what I did. I knew this day would come. I'm glad it did." David pulled out his phone. His hands were steady now, his purpose clear. He dialed 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, calmly relaying his location and the nature of the crime, he looked at James Collier. He didn't feel hatred. He didn't feel forgiveness. He just felt a vast, aching emptiness. The police arrived, their flashing lights washing the quiet street in surreal strobes of red and blue. James Collier didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved as they placed him in handcuffs and led him to the patrol car. The next day, guided by James's confession, a police forensics team and a heavy-duty cutting crew converged on the forgotten corner of the South Chicago Railyard. With a screech of metal, they forced open the door of Sleeper Car 7. The air that escaped was stale and heavy with the passage of time. Inside, they found what was left of Robert and Mary Porter. A month later, David stood in a quiet cemetery under a gray sky. He was surrounded by distant relatives and a few old friends of his grandmother. He was the only one who truly remembered the two people whose names were now freshly carved into the granite headstone before him. The ghost story finally had an ending. The mystery was solved. But as he stood there, he realized that the truth didn't fill the void his parents had left. It only gave it a name and a shape. He had spent his life defined by a question, and now he would have to learn to live with the answer. He was no longer the son of a mystery. He was the son of a tragedy, and in its own painful way, that felt like coming home. The conductor's actions started as a small, petty act of revenge, but spiraled into a tragedy that cost two people their lives and haunted him for decades. It makes you wonder, at what point does a simple grudge become an unforgivable crime? Was there a moment he could have turned back, and what would you have done in his shoes? If this story made you think, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates tales of mystery and the long, slow journey toward justice. Your support helps us continue to find and tell these important stories. Thank you for listening.